drawn and redrawn, the making of India's internal boundaries.
This podcast is part of India's State Stories project that explores the evolution of India's political and administrative boundaries. This is supported by the Center for Legislative Education and Research at Flame University in Pune. The previous episode delved into the complexities of administrative and financial integration. In this episode, we look at the Privy Purses. The Privy Purse was a unique phenomenon that guaranteed annual payments to former princely rulers, a small price for their cooperation in India's integration. We explore its historical origins, the complex negotiations over its amounts, and its constitutional backing. But the story doesn't end here. Learn how the Privy Purse was eventually abolished, a dramatic event that reshaped the status of India's formal rulers. This episode is based on the corresponding article written by our team at India State Stories. These articles have been converted to audio conversations with the help of Google's Notebook LM. You can find the relevant article link in the show notes. Now, let's dive into the conversation.
Imagine this, a brand new nation, India, just independent. It's trying to build a future, but it also has this complicated past, specifically hundreds of former princely states. And there's a promise made, a financial one. This isn't just some dusty historical detail. It's a story packed with really high stakes, tricky negotiations, and big disagreements about what India should even be. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something called the Privy Purse in India. We're going to unpack how these payments started, the deals that were struck, the huge constitutional fights about them, and how they were eventually scrapped. We'll look at all the different viewpoints and the massive impact this whole saga had on India's identity. We got some fascinating articles and research to guide us.
It's a really compelling area. What strikes me is the tension, a new democracy trying to create unity and equality, but at the same time, having to honor deals made with old monarchies. It's a fundamental clash right from the start. And this isn't just about the money, as you said. It's really about how you build a nation, where constitutional power lies, and how a country figures out its democratic path. For you, listening in, understanding this gives a real insight into post-colonial challenges.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning. The promise, the price tag. India becomes independent, and there's this arrangement for the old rulers, the Privy Purse. What exactly was it? How did it come about in that specific moment?
Well, basically, the Privy Purse was a fixed sum of money, paid annually, promised to the rulers of the princely states that joined India. It wasn't just a handshake deal. It was part of a formal historic settlement. This happened when these rulers signed the Instrument of Accession, that's the document, where they agreed to become part of India after 1947.
So it was a key incentive to get them on board. And looking at the sources, it seems it wasn't only about the cash, right? They were also guaranteed things like keeping their titles and property.
Exactly right. It was a whole package. In exchange for giving up their ruling powers and dissolving their states as independent entities, they got the Privy Purse, yes, but also guarantees about succession to their titles or gadi, certain rights and privileges, and significantly, ownership of their private properties. The idea was to make integration smooth, peaceful.
Kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, integrating over 500 different states. Saradar Patel, who was central to all this, famously called it a small price for the bloodless revolution. That's a powerful statement. Why was this price seen as necessary?
If you zoom out and look at the situation right after partition and independence, you see the sheer pragmatism. India needed unity fast. These agreements were crucial for bringing those 500-plus states into the fold quickly and, importantly, peacefully. It prevented potential chaos or even conflict when the new nation was incredibly vulnerable. And the idea wasn't totally new. The British had previously given pensions to rulers who ceded territory. So these payments were framed as consideration, like compensation for giving up their powers and the economic benefits tied to ruling. They were definitely political in nature.
Okay, so it was a strategic move.
Yeah.
But how did they decide how much each ruler got? It wasn't just random numbers, surely.
No, not random. There was a process. They consulted bodies like the Indian States Finances Inquiry Committee. The goal was to have some level of consistency and fairness, although, as we'll get into, that wasn't always straightforward.
Right, because this is where it gets really interesting. Even the main figures building independent India didn't all agree on this. You had Sardar Patel seeing it as necessary, almost the minimum possible, as he put it, but then you had Jawaharlal Nehru, the first PM. How did his view differ?
Nehru. Yes, his perspective really shows those early ideological debates. He was more, let's say, ambivalent. While he understood the need to keep promises, he wasn't keen on embedding these payments in the Constitution itself. He felt large payments were kind of unjustified in a democracy where masses were struggling. He actually wrote to some princes later, in 53 and 54, suggesting they might voluntarily give up some of their purse for development projects or national loans. It shows that tension between pragmatic unity and early socialist ideals.
And Mahatma Gandhi, where did he stand on this?
Gandhi's view was different again. Sources suggest he had a greater affinity towards princes compared to Nehru or even Patel. He apparently viewed giving the Privy Purses as a matter of elementary justice since they had signed away their states. So you see this fundamental difference right there at the top.
Absolutely fascinating. So, okay, they had these different views, but they still had to set the actual amounts. How do the calculations work? I read about an Eastern states formula, but also that some big states negotiated their own deals. And crucially, these payments were tax-free. That seems like a big deal.
It was a very big deal. Yes, the Eastern States formula was a common method. It calculated the purse based on a percentage of the state's average revenues, using 1945-46 as the baseline year. But for the larger, more economically viable states, the negotiations often went beyond that formula. The amounts could be higher, fixed ad hoc, sometimes after talking with local leaders. And yes, the tax exemption was key. It stemmed from the fact that previously, as sovereigns in their own states, they weren't taxed. It was a carryover from their old status.
Those negotiations must have been intense, dealing with hundreds of rulers, all with different situations and personalities. Can you give us some examples? Bring that process to life a bit.
Oh, absolutely. This is where you see the real drama unfold. Take the Kathiawar states in what became Saurashtra. Mostly small, not very wealthy states. But their rulers really pushed hard. They initially demanded 20% of their gross revenues, arguing about high living costs and maintaining prestige. VP Menon, the government's key negotiator, pushed back, of course. They eventually settled on 15%, using a different formula, the Deccan states won, but still, that was higher than many others got. Shows even smaller players had some leverage.
Interesting. So what about the really big states, like Gwalior or Indore? You must have had even more clout.
Definitely. For Gwalior and Indore, it was complicated because their rulers were already drawing huge sums personally from state revenues, like 32 lakh rupees for Gwalior, 18 lakh for Indore. They argued quite strongly that because they were merging viable states voluntarily, they deserved special consideration. After a lot of back and forth, Gwalior's purse was set at 25 lakh and Indore's at 15 lakh, so still very large sums reflecting their prior status.
Were there cases where, the ruler's personality or lifestyle really complicated things?
Oh, certainly. The Gaikwar of Baroda, Pratap Singh, is a classic example. He was known for, shall we say, an ostentatious lifestyle. He even tried to get Saradar Patel to sign a side letter guaranteeing no future financial claims. Patel just ignored it. Menon had to really emphasize that Baroda couldn't survive alone. Eventually, the Gaikwar signed, getting a privy purse of 26.5 lakh rupees. But Menon also had to negotiate the return of smuggled jewels and set up a trust for the Gaikwar's personal property. It really highlights how complex these integrations were, dealing with wealth, jewels, everything.
Smuggled jewels. It really does sound like something out of a movie. It wasn't just about borders on a map, was it? It was about integrating these massive personal fortunes and legacies.
Precisely. And another one, the Nawab of Bhopal, a very prominent ruler. His negotiations dragged on. He was reluctant to give up his Jagirs land grants, but finally agreed. His purse was settled at 11 lakh rupees, but notably it included a specific 1 lakh for his eldest daughter. Shows how tailored these agreements could become. All these examples, they just underscore the clash between the big political goals and the messy human details. In the end, the total annual payout for all privy purses came to about 580 lakh rupees. Some of the biggest were Hyderabad at 50 lakh, Baroda 26.5, Gwalior 25, and Mysore 26 lakh.
580 lakh rupees annually. That's a huge commitment for a new nation. And these weren't just promises, they were actually written into the Constitution itself, weren't they? In the Constituent Assembly debates, Articles 291, 362, and 366-22 were included. What did those articles actually guarantee?
That's right. They were constitutionally enshrined. Article 291 specifically guaranteed the payment of the privy purses. Article 362 protected the ruler's personal rights, privileges, and dignities. And Article 366, Clause 22, provided the definition of who legally counted as a ruler. So, putting it all together, the clear intention at the time was that these guarantees were permanent, set in stone, essentially meant to last in perpetuity.
In perpetuity. That sounds pretty final. But history had other plans. This constitutional guarantee was eventually overturned. How did we get from that seemingly permanent promise to the 26th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1971, which abolished them. What was the lead-up?
It was quite the political roller coaster. The first major attempt to get rid of the Privy Purses was the 24th Amendment Bill in 1970. But it actually failed narrowly in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of parliament. After that legislative defeat, Indira Gandhi's government changed tactics. They used executive power. A presidential order was issued on September 6, 1970. This order basically tried to de-recognize all the rulers overnight, and by doing so, nullify the constitutional articles related to their purses and privileges. It was a bold move, bypassing parliament.
Whoa, so the president just declared them not rulers anymore. That sounds like it would immediately end up in court.
And it did, immediately. The princes, with the Maharaja of Gwalior taking the lead, challenged that presidential order straight away. They argued it violated the original agreements, the covenants they signed. This resulted in a really significant Supreme Court case in 1971, Madhavrao Scindia versus Union of India. And the outcome: a major win for the princes. The Supreme Court struck down the presidential order, declaring it ultra vires, meaning the president didn't have the constitutional power to issue such an order.
So the highest court in the land sided with the princes. That must have been a big blow to the government's plans. What do they do next?
Give up.
Give up, not quite. Faced with that judicial defeat, the government doubled down. They decided the only way was to change the Constitution itself. That required a specific process involving Parliament. So they quickly introduced and passed the 26th Constitutional Amendment Act. This amendment did several things. It completely repealed Articles 291 and 362. It changed Article 366(22) to remove the definition of ruler. And crucially, it added a new article, 363A, which explicitly stated that recognition of rulers was withdrawn and the right to privy purses and privileges was extinguished. Game over, constitutionally speaking. That's a very decisive way to settle it. But how did the government justify this amendment, especially after the Supreme Court had just ruled against their earlier attempt? Did they have new arguments? And what about that idea of using paramountcy? That sounds a bit odd for a democracy.
They put forward a few key arguments. Firstly, they argued that the original presidential order, even though struck down, was an act of state, a political decision, and therefore shouldn't really be subject to judicial review anyway. Then came the controversial inheritance of paramountcy argument. Paramountcy was this complex British colonial idea where the crown held ultimate power over the princely states. The government basically argued that the supreme power had passed to the independent Indian state. Therefore, they suggested, being recognized as a ruler and receiving a privy purse wasn't an inherent right, but more like a gift from the president, which the state could modify or withdraw based on policy. Yes, invoking a colonial concept like paramountcy to justify action in a republic was and remains highly debated. Critics definitely saw it as problematic.
So less about legal fine points and more about the will of the people.
That was certainly a major part of the rhetoric. The government strongly argued that public consciousness had shifted. The idea of hereditary rulers with special privileges and tax-free incomes was, they claimed, no longer acceptable in a modern, socialist-leaning democracy focused on social and economic justice. And let's be frank, there were clear political calculations too. Many former princes had become involved in politics, often aligning with opposition parties like the Swatantra Party or the John Sang. Abolishing the privy purses was also seen as a way to diminish their influence and resources, dismantling a potential power base opposing Indira Gandhi's government.
So this abolition clearly had huge consequences, going way beyond just stopping the annual payments. What was the immediate effect on the former rulers themselves?
The most profound effect was the change in status. Overnight, legally and symbolically, they went from being former sovereigns with constitutionally protected privileges to just regular citizens. Of course, many retained wealth and social standing, and some continued successful political careers, but that traditional and extraordinary status they held, largely inherited from the British era, was officially gone. The curtain had finally fallen on the princely order.
Did they just accept this final act, or did they try to fight back somehow after the amendment passed?
They had already tried organizing. Back in 1967, anticipating these moves, they formed a group called the Rulers of Indian States in Concord for India. The goal was explicitly to fight the abolition and protect their position. But, according to the sources, much like earlier princely bodies, this group struggled. They faced internal divisions, old habits of worrying about rank and status, and frankly, they didn't really have the experience needed for modern political lobbying. Their efforts weren't enough to stop the constitutional amendment.
Going back to that paramountcy argument the government used, it seems like such a legally ambiguous move. What were the wider implications of the state using a colonial concept like that?
It's a really crucial point to analyze. Using paramountcy did suggest a kind of state power that might exist outside or above the normal constitutional framework. It raised questions about the state's ability to define and redefine citizenship or status through political action, not just law. It was a powerful assertion of the post-colonial state's authority. And this whole process also sharpened the government's focus on the other assets held by the princes, their palaces, their lands, their incredible collections of art and jewels.
Right. It wasn't just the annual income, but all the accumulated wealth.
Exactly. Increasingly, these vast properties and treasures began to be viewed less as purely private wealth and more as part of India's national wealth and heritage. This thinking contributed to new laws, most notably the Antiquity and Art Treasures Act of 1972, which aimed to regulate and control the movement and sale of items deemed antiquities, much of which was in princely hands. So if you connect it all, the abolition of the Privy Purses wasn't just closing a loophole or saving money. It was truly the final chapter in dismantling the centuries-old princely order. It served as a very potent symbolic declaration of India's democratic and unitary character.
Wow. So we've traced this whole arc from the initial promise made at a critical moment of nation building, through all the complex deals and the deep disagreements it sparked, right up to the constitutional battle and the final abolition. So what does this deep dive mean for you listening today?
I think it's a powerful reminder of how history, tradition, political necessity, and the ideals of a modern democracy can clash and reshape each other. It's about the messy, complex trade-offs involved in building a nation. And it leaves us with a really interesting question to ponder, doesn't it? Think about that tension. How does a democracy balance upholding agreements made in the past, even ones that seem unequal later, against the push for social and economic equality demanded by the people? What does this whole story tell us about sovereignty of the state versus perhaps the agreed-upon rights of individuals or groups within it, especially as a nation charts its own course?